Welcome to the Low Carb USA podcast, where we seek to inspire you to help us build this community. I'm Doug Reynolds.
And this is Pam Devine.
Okay. So, Pete Delannoy, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be speaking with you today. My name is Dr. Pete, and I'm a PhD biochemist and also a nutrition network coach practitioner, and also a member of the Society of Metabolic Health Practitioners, hopefully soon to be accredited. My main level of expertise is really in two main areas. The first is the fructose uric acid metabolism and how it relates to glucose metabolism, and how fructose uric acid metabolism is a driver of several chronic diseases, or well, actually, it is one of the central drivers of most of the metabolic diseases, and I'll come back to that in a minute. The other thing that I do along with my daughter is we actively coach people in terms of helping them reverse diabetes, improve cardiovascular disease. We also help people put gout in remission. And I am going to talk about gout a little bit today as well in this. If we come back to my assertion about the fructose uric acid metabolism being a central driver, there is a mass body of animal studies and clinical studies. Some of the speakers out there that have talked about this, like Dr. Richard Johnson, in his case, has published over 700 papers and spent decades in this area. And we also have heard from Dr. Robert Lustig in this regard. And if you track some of his papers, he's talked about these relationships that I'm going to get to today. The bottom line is that the fructose uric acid metabolism is driving type 2 diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease. There's strong evidence now towards driving Alzheimer's disease, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and gout. And those of us, or those people out there that know me, know that I might be the only specialist in the area of gout. And gout is the bastard child of chronic diseases. It's treated by the medical establishment like it's a severe headache, and as if it's disconnected from any other aspect of chronic disease. And I have to say that even in our space, the low carb space, there's a tendency to leave gout there as this external thing, where maybe one of our only concerns is whether or not you can go low carb because you're interested in reversing diabetes, as an example, or type 2 diabetes. And can you do that without aggravating a gout situation? But the key thing to understand about this, and the reason why I believe gout is so important that we take a more critical look at, is because gout is a terminal consequence of this central driving biochemical pathway, fructose uric acid pathway. And one of the things that I really want to emphasize today is that, and this Johnson and Lustig talk about this, maybe not as in direct of terms as I do, but understanding how these metabolic pathways are integrated. In other words, what I mean by that is that almost everything that we hear about very often in terms of diabetes is talking about this from a glucose-centric point of view. Glycolysis and how it ties into the Krebs cycle, and how we get to the production of fat in the liver, for example, when the glucose load gets too high. Or we're talking about fructose uric acid metabolism in isolation. And where I am coming from is that we have to think about these pathways in terms of how they operate together. because even like if we all step back and we think about how we were taught this stuff in school, and then for me later, how I was taught as an undergraduate about biochemistry, and then even in my PhD existence in graduate school, and then later in research, we tend to think about these pathways in isolation, number one. And then number two, we think about them under physiological conditions all the time. But the problem is, in the standard American diet, we don't have physiological conditions, right? We have meals which are happening 5 or 6 times a day. Most of them are hyperglycemic, so they're out of the physiological range. If there's added sugar in there, which could be coming from a myriad of ways, right? Table sugar itself, which is 50% by mass glucose and 50% fructose. And then we have the mixtures, high fructose corn syrups, the agave syrups, and then the processed food, which we know has not only added sugar in it of different forms, but there's also elevated salt, and Johnson's talked about this a lot, the umami stuff, glutamate containing compounds that have that richness, that sort of salty richness flavor, like monosodium glutamate, I think, is the most famous one, and you can think about that in terms of a bag of, whatever, Doritos that are coated with this material, and that flavoring also drives fructose uric acid metabolism. But anyway, I'm starting to digress. So the standard American diet is delivering at minimum a hyperglycemic load, a high glucose load at every single meal. And we're not talking, when we start to step back and go, what about the added sugar? Then you have high fructose coming in simultaneous to that. And for adults at the evening meal, you also have quite often an alcohol load. And Lustig has written about this, and he talks about it. He's more famous, so he's out there on the circuit, and people have heard him speak about the fact that fructose metabolism is alcohol without the buzz. So one of the key concepts here, though, underlying what I just said, is that at every single one of these meals, 5 or 6 a day, and then evening meal where alcohol might be there, one of the key central issues that the liver faces is that you have the arrival of this high load of glucose, a high load of fructose happening in relatively short period of time. And the fructose is coming into the liver in an unregulated fashion. There's no feedback mechanisms for this at all. The glucose, 20% of the glucose is going to come into the liver, but it is entering a pathway that is regulated, starting at the first step with its phosphorylation. And stepping back from this for a minute, and this is important because I don't want to get lost with it, but humans have been designed in our biology to have, basically, in a way of thinking, 2 operating systems. We have burning that allows us to produce energy. We need ATP as one of the molecular monies or molecular dollars. All right. There are other small molecules that we need for molecular money too, but let's just keep things simple. ATP is basically, you can think of that as molecular money. It's what we're going to spend to do everything. Right. And so the glycolysis is designed to produce money. And what gets to the end of glycolysis is going to feed into the mitochondria, where the main function of the mitochondria in this case is to produce more ATP. And under physiological conditions, the fats are going to get funneled in there too, so that you optimize how much of this money you're making. But once we move out of physiological conditions into the hyperglycemic state, and a state where we have a high load of fructose coming in, now the fructose uric acid pathway is going to be activated, and it's specifically activated In terms, the fructose activates it without any, that's a direct activation. But then we also have the hyperglycemic state, and this is what a lot of people miss. And in the evening meal, the alcohol, which actually activate fructose metabolism, they do it because they're funneled in through a biochemical pathway called polyol, which literally only has 2 steps. And the alcohol and the hyperglycemia activate a very important enzyme in that step. And the end problem here is that you end up producing endogenous fructose right in the liver. And then that fructose, and I use this word, it collapses into this sudden acute rise in uric acid. What does this mean when we think about these 2 pathways together that are interconnected? And what it means is that we reprogram our system. We reprogram the liver now to store fat, to produce fat and to store fat. And now the mitochondria simultaneously is going to be shuttling intermediates back out into the cytoplasm, where all of that stuff's going to get, the citrate coming out is going to be pushed into fat, de novo lipogenesis. And simultaneously to that, the mitochondria is shut down from burning. So it's not burning the fats anymore. And so the liver now is completely in a storage mode. And you have the fructose pathway is not completely in an isolated way just producing this elevated uric acid. It also is shuttling intermediates back into glycolysis on a lower level, which means that you're also going to build glycogen stores really fast. And we know that the liver doesn't have that great a glycogen storage capacity, right? It's only like around 500 calories capacity in the liver. The skeletal muscle has a little bit more. And I know I'm getting into the weeds here. So let's try to step back from this a little bit. It's important to recognize that fructose metabolism, the capability to do what I'm talking about, exists in our brain, adipose tissue, skeletal tissue, the intestine, right? And then also the liver and the kidney, and also in our joints, the chondrocyte, which is the specific biological cell that's responsible for everything to do with making sure that a joint, whether it's in your finger or in your knee, whatever joint that we're talking about, is being maintained on a healthy level. So you can do whatever it is that you're doing without being in pain over it. And in the case of someone who suffers from gout, not having gout, right? So this is a very important function. Fructose metabolism, in terms of what's going on in the joint, I think it's important to mention to the viewers that fructose metabolism is not written in stone there, but there's a lot of circumstantial evidence surrounding the biological function of this most important cell that's in there, and we can talk about that more in a second. But one thing I want to go back to what's going on with the liver, because that's the model system, and so you have this reprogramming that happens there, and one of the most important aspects of this is the load of macronutrients that are arriving at the liver, and then in the back of your mind you need to be thinking about these other tissues or other organs where this is happening as well. And yeah, there are nuances. In the kidney, this metabolism is mainly going on in the proximal tubules, and we have to remember that the kidneys are also involved in glucose homeostasis. And the responsibility for most of that in the kidney is in the proximal tubules. So you have the most central organ involved in this being the liver, and the kidneys second to that are managing glucose homeostasis in a human body. And the fructose uric acid pathway, which is happening because of this overload, and in the standard American diet, you have chronic elevation of these factors happening all day long. So this pathway where you're diverting glucose, right, and you're elevating intracellular uric acid, which is driving systemic inflammation within the liver and these other organ systems that I'm talking about, along with disruption of nitric oxide, think downstream of this cardiovascular disease, all right, and then reprogramming in terms of burning. So instead of utilizing fat and glucose to produce ATP, everything's going into a storage capacity. And in the liver, what this means is that you're going to have oil droplets forming literally right in there. You're going to have the production of these triglycerides that are being repackaged into the VLDL along with ApoB100. And that stuff is being shipped out in the circulatory system. When we sit back and we think about what we hear, like quite often in the conferences that you run and that I attend, we hear about, okay, we have these carbohydrate-driven triglycerides. That's what we're talking about right now. That's why these triglycerides are getting elevated in the bloodstream of people that are eating these high carbohydrate, hyperglycemic meals, for example. That's why this is going on. And that's predominantly going on with the liver. And, you know, there's plenty of clinical data. When you look at the body of Johnson's work, it's striking. Over 700 publications there. Not all of it is in animal studies. That's a big criticism that we hear a lot of when we talk about fructose uric acid metabolism. Well, it's mice and rats. It doesn't make any difference for humans. That's not the case here. We do it. There is clinical data, plenty of it, enough to say, well, we should really be paying attention to this. And Lustig has done some stuff too, right, with children. He's shown that if you just get rid of the fructose, and I have some criticism about this, but if you just get rid of the fructose, then you see their fatty liver reverse. The thing that we got to remember about that is that kids are kids, and their system is more resilient, right? It's not like me, who was diagnosed with prediabetes and a gout sufferer at 60 years old, right? We have to remember that a lot of people are more like me. They're older when these chronic diseases set in. There's more organ damage at the level of kidney, because we have to remember in the kidneys where this fructose metabolism is dominant is in the proximal tubules. And that's where there's been actually a substantial amount of data coming in about the effect of uric acid driving this process, right? And then when you have the realization, well, that part of the kidney is also running, it's doing its part up to 46% of glucose homeostasis. It's like, okay, when we get to type 2 diabetes, and this is going to sound like I'm off topic, but we heard from Dr. Sivas in San Diego, right, about his assertion that insulin resistance is more complicated than we think about, right? And my point by saying that is that, yeah, I totally agree with that. When we cannot look at type 2 diabetes and obesity and Alzheimer's, of which there's a lot of accumulating data about the role of fructose metabolism and the sudden acute rise in uric acid in damaging those energy systems that exist in the neurons that contribute to the inability to process glucose. So when we go back to the kidney, you know, it's pretty scary, because for those of us that are older who get diagnosed, for me, it was prediabetes. When you start looking more closely functionally at those persons, you start to see that they've got other issues. It's not just about fatty liver, right? Which I'm pretty certain I was suffering from, and I saw my liver numbers improve right away, right? Like there's no argument here when we start talking about, okay, if you're suffering from these chronic diseases and you start to lower the carbs, you see rapid improvement in A1C, your fasting glucose levels start to stabilize right away. If you're tracking liver numbers and kidney numbers, I saw mine improve right away and those things. So there's an interrelationship here. And anyway, I know I'm going on right now, but one of the main points I wanted to stress in our talk today is how important it is, because I get pushback frequently about, Dr. Pete, why does the science matter? Why do you care so much about looking so hard at these biochemical pathways? And my answer is that we need to understand to a much higher degree how these biochemical pathways are interrelated, and how the priority of how one pathway is working relative to another is shifting around when we're elevating these macronutrients that are coming in or when we bring them down, right? There's a big difference studying glycolysis and the function of a mitochondria in the Krebs cycle under physiological conditions versus looking at what's happening to that system when you're dealing with a hyperglycemic event. And in the case of the standard American diet, it isn't just hyperglycemia, right? We know that. It's also the incoming sugar that has the high load of fructose. And in the evening meal for adults, and I was in this situation for, decades, where I'm having 2 or 3 beers every night, how is that contributing to this load that's coming in, right? And when we go back to the gout situation and we start asking questions about the condition of the joint, hyperglycemia plays a massive role in low-grade inflammation of the central biological cell and other cells that are in the joint. And when we bring in uric acid into that picture, this is how we are getting a gout flare. So circling all the way back, and then I'm going to be quiet so you can ask some questions. When we circle all the way back to the gout issue, and my assertion that we cannot look at gout like it's a bastard stepchild and is an annoyance, both to the gout sufferer, who basically is just going to take anti-inflammatories, right? And to the clinicians that are looking at this, because a gout sufferer really needs to be analyzed for their complete blood panel, right? Maybe they need to do a coronary artery calcium score, right? They need to do all of that, because gout sufferers, 74% of them have high blood pressure, 71% of them have kidney disease, 25% of them are diabetic, and 15% or slightly lower than that suffer from cardiovascular disease. Yet if you're a gout sufferer and you go to the doctor, and this has been my experience and also the subscribers on my YouTube channel, the only thing that they do is measure your uric acid, and then they send you out the door with an inflammatory drug, anti-inflammatory drug, and tell you not to drink alcohol and get exercise and eat a healthy diet. That's what they do. When in fact, somebody who's suffering from gout, there's almost no chance that they are also not suffering from a chronic disease. So anyway, what I'm trying to argue here is that all this is interrelated, and we need to take the relationship between the glucose-centric model of insulin resistance, and we need to see how fructose uric acid metabolism is tied together with this.
So maybe let's just go back a little bit with respect to gout. I have been lucky enough that I've never suffered with it, but What's a typical age when gout starts to show it? I mean, because people are eating this crappy diet from when they're little kids, right? So, but when does gout typically start showing up?
Well, the statistics are very similar to pre-diabetes and diabetes. In other words, the older the people are, the higher the risk. And
Right.
most people get their first gout flare, most of them, in their 50s, which is consistent with me. I was in my upper 50s, 59, and then the pre-diabetes, no, 57. And then at 59, I was diagnosed with pre-diabetes. However, I need to mention that there are younger people that are being afflicted with gout earlier on. And I also need to say that that my gout hypothesis is just that, it's a hypothesis. I am trying to urge people I collaborate with in terms of trying to bring education out there, mainly Richard Johnson, to actually bring gout into the laboratory, right? He has the capabilities to do this. I'm hoping he will. But the reason that I'm qualifying this is because there are younger people that get gout early, and there are some people that get refractory gout. In other words, it's just like literally one flare after another. I see, and this is not experimental, obviously, but you got to start somewhere. And even Feldman started this way. And the people that I interact with my YouTube channel, I'd say about 50% of them, by shifting low carb and monitoring their uric acid, can put gout in remission. And I think that, and I have done that, and I would say about 50% of my followers have done that. And then you have this other 50% where it seems like the issue is more complicated. And what I would argue to that is to remember that if you're eating this way for decades, then reversing kidney disease, for example, is not something that's going to happen overnight. For some of us, the damage in the proximal tubules because of the uric acid effect is probably something we're going to live with for the rest of our lives. This is similar to, if you think about serious type 2 diabetics that go low carb, right? We know that if you can catch diabetes early, that you essentially, there's plenty of data for this out there now. I mean, it started with Verta, but there's plenty of data out there now. We know we can reverse that. And probably they're done with it. But if you've been a diabetic for 30 or 40 years to a very high degree, and you've got the damage, neuronal damage, kidney damage, and even liver damage beyond a certain point, well, you can probably become asymptomatic, right? And you can improve the situation, but I think you are going to be stuck with some of these issues, right? Just thinking commonsensically about the situation, and I think you have that. I think you have that going on with gout too. So that if you've been having multiple flares for a really long time, there's going to be damage in the joint where the gout is typically happening, and yeah.
So look, just talking about diabetes for a minute. I mean, I did an interview with Tim Noakes a few years ago, and at that stage, it was all famous that he went and did this, took on this keto diet because he was trying to lose a bit of weight before he went to do a lecture to some athletes in Oslo or something like that. And in the end, it started, it obviously improved his diabetes immensely. And so he got down to where he was down to like 5.5 A1C or something, but he was still taking a bit of metformin because he wanted his A1C to be even lower than that, to have even stronger control. And I think he may now have got off it completely. But as you mentioned, there's all the people that have had it chronically for a long, long time are likely to have incurred other damage that they can't reverse. So when you talk about reversing the type 2 diabetes, that, like you said, they become asymptomatic as far as diabetes goes. But there's other damage that's happened that's often not reversible. So that's the kind of thing you're talking about here as well, right?
Yes, that's exactly right.
But at the same time, I still don't know that there's 50% of the people. I personally wouldn't believe that there's 50% of the people that are that far gone that they're unable to reverse it. I feel like it was a similar thing when Steve Finney, basically at one of our events, he gave like the 2-year stats on the Verter health results, and he was there talking about a 50% success rate as well. And my question was really like, why is that so low? I would have expected it to be much higher. But there's other factors involved in this, and it's adherence to the lifestyle and the diet itself, and other lifestyle confounding factors that contribute to it. It's not that the diet itself didn't work. It's just that there's either they were struggling to do it right. We're learning more and more about carb addiction now and how difficult it is for people to really stick to it. And especially if they're bad addicts, they're going to be fibbing about what they've been eating as well. So they'll say, I stayed on this diet and I did it all right and everything, but quite often they didn't really. Do you feel like that 50% is a similar thing where a lot of those people are just struggling in one way or another, or have other metabolic or other conditions that might be affecting how they respond to this protocol in terms of trying to fix it?
Well, I'm really glad that you asked that question, actually, because two things, and I didn't get a chance to talk about this yet. This is really, besides the gout, this is the other area that I'm really specializing in, and that's the sugar addiction thing. But before I get into that, I think there are nuances about the diabetes reversal. The part that you brought up about compliance, that I believe has to do with the sugar addiction. So I'm going to get to that in a second. But when you look at the range of individuals, we're not all the same. There are some people, and this is what I was trying to make a point about earlier, that we have this core dysfunction, if you will, of our metabolics. And the way that shows up in people is different, right? Some people are morbidly obese and have type 2 diabetes on top of that. There are others, I think, who are more like me, who were thin on the outside and fat on the inside, and went in the direction of the prediabetes and the gout. And I don't know about the cardiovascular disease back then. I mean, I know where my markers are now. But anyway, what is my point? My point is that I think as humans, we respond to this eating environment. We have the same core drivers, if you will, but we respond to that environment differently based on our genetics and probably other things I can't think of right now. So I think that there are nuances about this, and here's something that I didn't talk about yet. For gout sufferers, for example, there's 43 million people walking around in the United States with hyperuricemia. And 35 million of those, I want to make sure not to get my stats wrong here, 35 million of those hyperuricemics, high uric acid, don't get gout. But 9 million of them have uric acid crystal deposition throughout their body, and including heart valves and coronary artery system. You find uric acid crystals, or to be specific, to be more correct, sodium urate crystals, actually in plaques. And I'm hoping to be able to ask, oh shoot, I can't think of his last name. For some reason, it's a gap for me, but he talked at Boca. This is the cardiac doctor in Florida. You know, Agustin.
Arthur Agustin, yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to ask him about that, because there's imaging techniques where you can look at plaque, for example, and identify whether or not there's actually a part of that plaque if the uric acid crystals are in there, and if he's considered looking at that with his patients, because there's other investigators that have actually shown that. But so my point is that even if you get into gout remission, one of the hangovers from that is hyperuricemia, which can continue. And I'm in that situation. And this is and probably the central reason for that is because of the long-term damage in the proximal tubules of the kidney.
Okay.
You have, for uric acid, you have a production issue and you have the excretion issue. And the kidneys are in charge of the excretion. The proximal tubules is where it happens, along with glucose homeostasis. All right, down the road we go.
Mm-hmm.
Now, coming back to the sugar addiction thing, when it was actually 2 years ago, and I gave my first talk at the World Summit, Nutrition Network World Summit, and what I talked about was what I was seeing with my clients, which was the compliance issue. Why, speaking metaphorically, why is this person, why do they keep going back to the carbs? And it wasn't just going back to carbs in general, it was going back to sugary carbs. Why can't they let go? What is going on with this person? And usually in my interactions with these people, with my clients who I care about deeply, it was usually secretive. Like, it would usually take me a while to get to what it was when I was looking at their fasting glucoses and thinking, why is this glucose, if this guy, as he's telling me, is being compliant, why is his glucose back to 250 this morning? What happened yesterday? And then when you look at the cycle, over weeks and then months, it's like, all of a sudden there's this periodical nature to it. And it was like, okay, what was going on here? And it was going back to these sugary items. And in that talk, I talked about this. I'm like, I think we're dealing on the practical side of this, trying to help people with a continuum between dealing with the cravings that you have. And part of this is a physical, my own physical experience with this, right? When I started the ketogenic diet 4 years ago, contending initially, at least, with these cravings and my craving for alcohol, and going, okay, this is the biochemist in me, and I'm going, there has to be a biochemical driver for this, because the brain can't know what you're eating until you eat it. The signaling has to start somewhere. And all of, at least what I've read 4 years ago, at least then, before I knew what I know now, most everything I was reading talked about the brain effect. And I'm not disputing that. That's where the research has started, the neuroimaging and things like that. But as my knowledge grew, and my understanding of Dr. Richard Johnson's body of work, which is massive, and the realization that sucrose, and now specifically fructose, when somebody starts eating that, they are driven to eat more. There is the initiation of compulsive behavior. There's this whole myriad of effects that, when you line those effects up with the sugar addiction parameters, it's like they they match. And when you start to look at the fructose uric acid pathway and how it relates to signaling that starts in our tongues, the liver responds to that with the vagal nerve, and then also the intestinal response, which not only has taste receptors, and here's something that I have to talk about because there's a nuance. In terms of what happens in the tongue, we have a preference for sweet, and of the sweet, we have a preference directly for fructose, and there's very strong signaling with the brain. And the issue with the brain is actually really interesting because in the beginning, I thought, all right, we have this incoming food and we have these macronutrients coming into the mouth. And so common sense, what is the signaling that is going on to the brain? And then what is the signaling from the liver to the brain? And then what is going on with the intestines, which not only involves taste sensoring, but the taste sensoring is nuanced because the intestinal cells that are there can tell the difference between the macronutrients. And there's different levels of signaling depending on whether, glucose is coming in or fructose is coming in, fats and proteins, all this gets really complicated. But the thing that's really scary about the brain is that it also has nutrient sensing on its own, right? Because a hyperglycemic event that shows up at the brain because of the polyol pathway is going to initiate fructose uric acid metabolism. And the initiation of fructose metabolism causes the upregulation of a protein called delta phos-B. And delta phos-B, and this assertion I'm going to make now comes from the decades and decades of work of the substance abuse people, the guys that study the molecular basis for cocaine, heroin, amphetamines, down the road, alcohol, down the road we go. And they came to the conclusion with reams of data a long time ago that elevation of delta phos-B happens to be the pinnacle protein that drives the addictive state. And we know now that sucrose and fructose metabolism literally in the brain activates that protein that drives the addictive state. And we're not even talking yet about the food reward system, which the establishment out there pushes back on the food reward system, and they say, well, just because it activates the same reward system as cocaine and alcohol and the rest of that doesn't mean that food's addictive. But what I'm saying is, okay, fine with your argument. Then how do you explain delta phos-B? And it isn't just delta phos-B, because delta phos-B activates this whole cascade of other transcription factors. And so when you sit back and you look at this, the fructose uric acid metabolism coupled to the glycolytic pathway into the mitochondria, I want to argue we need to pay much more attention to the weeds end of this. We really do. It matters to us. And it matters to us because as a coach, I'm working with people that are addicted to sugar. Some of my clients are addicted to it. And we need better strategies to help them. So how do we do that? Part of that obviously is the massive experience that people like Joan Ifland and Bitten Janssen have working directly with these people, right? Massive amounts. They know what to do and what not to do. But what I'm saying is that we need to understand our biochemistry better, because then we can even tweak those strategies to get more success. Because with sugar addicts, there are nuances there too. When you talk with some of these people, they talk about, well, I went carnivore and I'm still having problems with volume eating. And I'm looking at that going, look at uric acid, look at the fructose uric acid pathway and ask the question, what are the central activators? alcohol, hyperglycemia, and glutamate containing protein. That's a powerful activator. And somebody who's eating carnivore is eating predominantly meat. Now, don't get me wrong, Doug. I'm not arguing going on a plant-based diet here. I don't think it's a mistake if they want to do that or plant-based. I'm not arguing against that. But what I'm saying is perhaps a carnivore who's still experiencing these volume issues needs to map out the protein that they're eating, over a couple of weeks, and just ask the question, all right, which of these meats is high in glutamate? And is there anything that I'm putting on that meat, like high salt is an activator of polyol? How am I eating it? And what am I eating exactly? And then perhaps moderating that a little bit more so that maybe the drive for the volume starts to go down. This is the kind of strategy that I'm talking about here.
Yeah, no, this is like really fascinating, and like you said, a lot of what you're talking about with about gout is that it's a hypothesis, right? There's no
Right.
Hopefully, maybe you can design some kind of small pilot study or something that we can take to the SMHP, and maybe down the road as we start to collect some money, our idea on that side with the SMHP is to try to fund studies and stuff, for people that were in the normal world that they just couldn't get funding for it,
Right.
because of what it's trying to study, right? So yeah, we need to get something like that done. I mean, not your hypothesis, but you've got a lot of anecdotal data as well of all of these people that you've been working with that have adopted this lifestyle and diet and have responded positively. So that's all good data, but it's not a trial.
I know.
And some people just always point fingers and so there's no clinical control trial. So until you do that, it's all you can talk about is like your successes and what in your observations. And again, I think going back to the addiction side of it, it's something that I've learned over the years that I've done these conferences, that right in the beginning we had one person, Nicole Avena, I think, was the very first person I had speaking about addiction, and the reason I looked her up was that Tim Noakes in his trial had mentioned her as one of the gurus, I suppose you can call it, in this food addiction, carb addiction world. He mentioned it during his trial, and so I went and looked her up and invited her to come and speak. And Rob Cybus actually came to visit me at that event. I had never met him before, and so he kind of just attended and dominated the mic a lot, like Rob can get, because he had so much he wanted to say and ask, especially when Nicole was up there, because that's like addiction is a big deal for him. And I've had him regularly now, and we've had Joan Ifland has become a very regular speaker at our events. And the one coming up now in Boca is we have an entire day. The whole first day is basically just about carbohydrate addiction. Like we got, I think Tro is basically organizing that day, Tro Collation, and we've got Dave and Jen Unwin from the UK coming out to speak. We've got Joan and James Greenblatt and Nicole's coming and Rob's talking, and we got like 9 people lined up on the first day. Just the whole day is talks and panels about. And even Tro is even running the day before for people that get in early. He's actually having a workshop on the Thursday afternoon for practitioners in that who are trying to learn how to manage their patients who are battling to stay on the rails because of this sugar carb addiction thing, which is so powerful. So yeah, I applaud what you're doing and all the research that you're doing and everything. And hopefully we on the SMHP side will be able to help you get a trial in place at some point. That would be really cool.
Yeah, I would really be excited about that. I'm going to email Richard Johnson again because he has a laboratory where this can be done.
Yeah, so you guys work with him and put something down on paper, like a plan, like and let's see if we can help you there, and either to find the funding for it or to go to the SMHP and ask them if they can find the funds to do that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Awesome. Yeah,
All
I'm
right.
really excited about that first day at Boca. Yeah. I'm looking forward to that. That's
All right.
going to be awesome. Yeah.
And just you did a poster presentation at the San Diego event. Are you planning to bring that poster to Boca as well?
Actually, what I was going to ask you is if I can bring 2 posters there.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So put the applications in. I'm hoping that it all depends on how many people respond and how many boards
Right.
we're able to get into the space that we've got.
Well, one for sure.
One for sure, but you can't. Yeah, put both applications in, and if we can accommodate you, well, I mean, we had one person that submitted 5 in San Diego, so two won't be unusual. Okay, yeah, thanks, Peter. This has been a really fascinating talk, and I look forward to chatting to you like at dinner and stuff in Boca in January, because this conversation is like really important.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks for the opportunity to speak with you today. It's great.
Thanks for your time, man. It's been awesome.
All right.
Okay.
Have a good day.
You too.
You've been listening to an episode of the Low Carb USA podcast. You can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/lowcarbusa.